This week's book review with Neville Gibson is a big one, weighing 1.5 kilograms in fact. The English text of the Treaty of Waitangi looks like the work of a lifetime by author Ned Fletcher. So Neville, do we really need another book about the treaty? Surely it's the most written about subject in history already.
This is the Lord of the Rings, isn't it? The one to knock them all out. There's dozens of books on the Treaty of Waitangi, most of them pretty straightforward. This one takes quite a different approach, and I've got to say it's probably not for the average reader.
Not for the faint-hearted.
And not for the faint-hearted, but it's written by a lawyer, Ned Fletcher, and it is really looking at the legal background to the Treaty of Waitangi, why it was drawn up, how it was conceived and how it was implemented, but pretty much cuts off shortly after the implementation, so it doesn't go into all the debates we've had about the Treaty of Waitangi that happened well into the in the 19th century.
What does it say about, what does he say about the origins of the treaty?
Well, you had New Zealand had a strange sort of status, and it was not, and the British had a lot of traders, whalers, and really they all around the British Empire they needed to protect these people, not just for themselves, but also that they might do harm to the indigenous people. So that was the driving force behind the Colonial Office. Despite its name, it was not about settling these territories or anything like that, but you did need to have a kind of there was no government in New Zealand, and it really started with the Confederation of United Tribes and the Colonial Office thinking we should do a treaty with them. They can look after their own people, and so that's where the story starts.
So there's some school of thought that the treaty was a fraud, that there was one version for the British colonialists and one for Maori.
Yeah, this is the key takeaway from this book, because Ned Fletcher actually blows that apart. He debunks that theory, says that both sides acted in very good faith, and particularly in the Colonial Office, because their main aim was not to do any damage to the indigenous people, allow them to run their own show, but to protect the rights of anybody who was there, whether they were there permanently or temporarily, and to make sure that they obeyed some sort of law, and that law was an imperial law, but it covered only the Europeans, not Maori. But of course, there was a lot of mayhem and chaos in a lot of these places, and that's where the rules came from, the Colonial Office, who pretty much wrote the treaty.
So if the treaty was done in good faith, what went wrong?
Yeah, that's a good point, that the book doesn't really cover that, but what you had is a lot of forces in the, you're talking about the period from 1840 onwards. The pressure was from out of Europe, not just from England, but all nations in Europe to immigrate. And there were colonial settlement companies wanting, and they wanted land. And that's about a half of this book is about the land rights issue, very complicated, very legalistic. But basically what happened in New Zealand was the Maori population wasn't that large. It was a few 100,000 at most, possibly a lot less than that. And the settlers started off with just 30,000 when the treaty was signed. But by 1852, the population had grown quite a bit. And then after that, it was a scale of immigration that really turned the tables, and and the balance of power shifted quite dramatically.
Does the spirit in which the treaty was conceived have relevance today?
Well, I was looking at the book because this is a big book and it takes a lot of reading. And why would you bring it out at this time and focus on why it was written and how it was written, that sort of thing? So really you have to draw your own conclusions. But I think if we go back and say that the original treaty was done in good faith, you can reinterpret it, because what's happened is a lot of historians said, as you mentioned, considered it a bit of a fraud, and I think that led to a lot of fractious debate. So the debate from now on, if this book has any influence at all, is that we might reach a more realistic view of what the treaty was all about and what it and the role it plays in the future.
This is a daunting read. Some may say a cure for insomnia, but what would you advise the general reader to do in terms of tackling it?
Well, Ned Fletcher is a lawyer, pretty good one by this. He writes well. So if you read I found the best parts were the early parts which sort of sketching the history of New Zealand and all that sort of thing. There's a lot of detail of land rights, that kind of thing. You can probably, your eyes glaze over. Then he's got some very good conclusions, because he not only draws conclusions from what happened, but also the key personnel. I haven't mentioned them so far, but that's quite fascinating about the people who are involved in it, and I think that's what there's a good general value there, even if you only read half the book, the first part and the last half.
Well, thanks very much, Neville Gibson.
Pleasure.